Hello everyone, today we talk about the history of medieval Southeast Asia. So recently I started this kind of series of videos that won't be very long, telling the truth, about the medieval history, this condensated medieval history of these major regional areas of the world. I started with medieval Africa. I've recently have done something about medieval India, and now we are in Southeast Asia. So this is going to be naturally an approximation, but I think it can be useful because I think that the most important thing, definitely if you want to begin from scratch with certain regions of the world, I personally, myself, am quite ignorant about the history of medieval Asia, at least aside from the Near East and Middle East. I really have even I don't know so much, not even about China, about Japan, but I think this is also a good exercise for myself, telling you the truth. And secondly, I believe that the most important thing is really setting up the essentials, because sometimes it happens also for other topic. I mean, for every single topic that you kind of come across it by chance. And you usually come across usually to a detail of that history of those places. So actually I know myself a lot of things, a lot of scattered things about these areas, but really I don't have the clear picture of the whole. So it's normal, it happens. So instead approaching the topic from a kind of a schematic and essential way, I think it's good. And I don't know if I will make it, and nevertheless, this is not really, but I'll try my best. And also in here I'm using all transliterations because I don't know any Southeast Asian language, so I ask your pardon for any kind of mispronunciation, misspelling, etc. So, as for the other videos of the series, I start with a consideration about how indeed how far this world was actually for the Europeans. India was already enough far. The Southeast Asia was definitely almost unknown, and I say almost because indeed the Europeans had known partly those lands. They since ancient times there were European merchants and that crossed into Southeast Asia to reach China. So obviously there was the knowledge there were other lands there, but the information collected was pretty scanty and not really scientific in a geographical from a geographical point of view. So it was just given that these lands existed for someone, but definitely the majority of the population was pretty much ignorant even of the same existence, especially during the Middle Ages, but not only. Really, it's really how the world was looked at the time, previously than modern times. Excuse me, I drink a little bit. And this is a paradox exactly for what we've just said, because indeed the lands of the Southeast Asia provided to international trade a huge quantity of especially the so prized and so requested spices. So a lot of goods that came, especially from spices, but not just that, from the Far East. Indeed, that exists in Europe came from the Far East, and therefore this ignorance, however, was not enough, definitely, to stem the trade, which goes a bit by itself. You can argue at least bit by bit. Naturally, the traffics were extremely complex in a way. They were organized and they developed, and also in here while the Europeans generally didn't have much knowledge about this. Naturally, well, obviously the Chinese did, for instance, the Muslims did, also because this area in medieval times gets, is absorbs Islam. Islam travels across, and I already hinted at this, I think also in the video on India, is that sometimes you're amazed how in the Middle Ages you find the knowledge of figures like Alexander the Great or other other historical figures of the ancient world through the Muslim advance. I mean, the Arabs that had got in possess of the treasures of the Byzantine libraries, so this enormous quantity of knowledge from ancient times, that incidentally the Arabs not only part of the knowledge that the Arabs got was lost by the Byzantines themselves. This is a perspective that is not usually very much talked. I know it's a frontier of the most updated historiographical research. I mean, to see how, at least, however, certain knowledge that was of the ancient world was treasured by the Arabs, and we kind of know that from the Muslim tradition rather than from the Western tradition. And the Arabs and then the Muslims in general were, for instance, obsessed by the figure of Alexander the Great that I just named, and I think up to Indonesia, this is the point, through the Islamic advance, this figure was surely known. By the way, I'm sure that the figure of Alexander the Great was known even before, because it was a kind of a mythical figure, and this was absorbed even by the, I think even the religions, kind of the mythology of certain populations throughout all Asia, but it was reinforced by these classical knowledge was spread through the Islamic advance. What is it I find personally fascinating about Southeast Asia in itself? It's that, in spite of being so close to the Chinese Empire at all times, and even being part of it as a, let's say, at least as client states by a certain extent. Think about Vietnam. We'll see now. Was formerly for a very long time, since the beginning of the Middle Ages up to roughly the 10th century, part of under Chinese domination. But nevertheless, these cultures of Southeast Asia were, however, capable of developing very original and independent cultures. And not just that, but also statual organizations. That is, and this is often overlooked, I believe, how these populations managed to build something also pretty consistent, also in terms of political military power in the area, and remaining relatively undetached from China. Obviously, Chinese influence has always been massive, and it kind of worked also as a spin-off. Indeed, even just think about the markets and etc. As we said before, if you want to travel from China on the sea route into the Indian Ocean, you necessarily have to pass through Southeast Asia, and this therefore had made certain local communities rich, also because of trade. In fact, we'll see it. So it's even difficult. With India it's relatively easier, but with Southeast Asia it's even difficult to frame. However, what we're talking about for Middle Ages, because there are not such evident watersheds like that can correspond more or less to the ones we use in the West. But nevertheless, this is, I guess, the point. It's obvious that the Middle Ages never existed as such. So, however, roughly at the beginning of our own Middle Ages, let's put it in this very self-assertive way as Westerners, there was this immense area that comprehends the today's states of Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, etc. Well, this was framed under this empire. It was known as the Khmer Empire. And the Khmer Empire is its capital was famously Angkor, and this had a huge importance. It was actually a pretty big city, and this interestingly enough, this was an area very heavily influenced not just by China but also by India. So we've seen India, at a certain point with the Sultanate of Delhi, kind of had an empire that could really influence heavily, also directly enter into contact with Southeast Asia. But even though India's been kind of also split up most of the times, nevertheless, it was very influential on Southeast Asia as much as China. So this is important to bear in mind. So what's the Khmer Empire? Why is it called this way? Well, the Khmer are considered as such a population of Cambodia. So they part of these this population is present also in the provinces of the Siam and Annam, because of certain territorial modifications that now we won't go really in detail with. And however, this population has an extremely ancient history. And the first, as it's kind of obvious, I would say, the first historical evidence we have of the Khmer population comes from the Chinese sources. And the Chinese sources designate the region of Cambodia under the name of Funan or Xin La, which I don't know what it means, to tell you the truth, because these are all names that definitely had a built-up meaning. At this time I haven't researched that, I'm sorry, but if you Google that, I'm sure you can find it. Although it's not excessively easy to find informations on the internet. I used a couple of books to check out certain things, but usually also Google something to see and if how much it's really discussed on the internet, and there is not really much. It's often a synthesis, but I'm sure there is a more extensive bibliography on the topic. And what is interesting of the Khmer is that, especially in the ancient times, let's put it in this way, as a periodizing name, the major influence on the Khmer was not China, as a matter of fact, but India. And in fact, this the Khmer, so the adopted the Brahmanism, as well as Sanskrit, and later also Buddhism. So there was a sort of first attempt of it was a sort of national dynasty at a point, and that was established roughly in the 5th century, and that got extinguished in the 7th. So at this point, actually, the unity of this land was pretty low. It was broken, and there was essentially the rise of two different states in the Khmer area. And at this point, however, around the 9th century, the Khmer Empire comes once will become an empire, a unique empire once again, because this had split essentially in two different dynasties, and especially under the king Yayavarman II, the Khmer Empire reaches its greatest political power, as well as artistical production, and this is actually, in fact, the moment from which you see the very big and very famous monuments of Angkor. They are actually amazing, and although the maximum splendor of Angkor, especially with the building of the temple of Angkor Wat, seems to have been into the 12th century. Now you understand also in here, just for make you understand how history work. In absence of substantial evidence, we don't even know in here into what would be now the High Middle Ages, when certain things were built, when certain things existed. And this naturally happens because the local civilizations didn't produce a big deal written records, or at least they didn't arrive to us and we can't really understand when things happen. But generally speaking, and this is a big difficulty because it can amaze you also in relatively to areas of the world that are pretty similar, that are pretty close geographically, how one produced a huge amount of sources and another one basically didn't. You can see this also with Europe by a certain extent, but also in here, think about China, think about India, how much these were the great civilizations were built along the major rivers of Asia, and you understand they produced something. These other populations had a different environmental situation. They kind of developed less, and therefore, even if they were so close and influenced by the others, we know a very few, or at least fewer than the others, because and most of what we know is naturally something that is written also by other peoples, not just what was produced locally, at least in historiographical terms especially. And at this time the Khmer Empire is pretty aggressive, actually, pretty warlike, and their emperors managed to destroy the rival Champa kingdom or empire. So we can talk about this. It essentially was a Vietnamese power. Also in here we have a relatively few historical evidence. We have mostly archaeological finds to say, okay, well, yeah, this was a place where we find ruins of buildings were built in mountains and with stone sculptures and stills, etc. And there is some kind of diplomas and other documents from the same Vietnam and China that tell us about this. And this the Champa were actually much closer to China as a cultural influence. However, through the Cambodian Funan kingdom around the 4th century, Indian culture also permeated, just like it happened within the Khmer Empire. Sanskrit was adopted, especially as sort of an elite language, and also Hinduism, and especially the cult of Shiva, because, by the way, that became a religion of state. So the history of religion, the religions of Asia, is extremely complicated, nevertheless extremely fascinating, because what you realize is that in this huge area, certain religions that originated from the sense sanitary civilizations with pretty large number of inhabitants that kind of built up this structured religion in a certain sense, were adopted in other minor entities in different ways. And always consider, in this sense, was being polytheism, especially, that this was extremely fluid, as everything could be really taken. And this happens by certain extent also much closer to us, telling the truth. But in here, in Asia, it was, in my opinion, much more dynamism, especially in adopting certain perspectives of, I don't want to get too bad. So, however, from the 10th century onwards, especially with the maritime trade of the Arabs, the Champa were increasingly influenced by Islam, and there were also a lot of trade with Cambodia as well, and there were actually the dynasties of these empires actually intermarried, so it was kind of normal. There was a lot of trade exchange with the Srivijaya Empire. That was that we'll see kind of later, and this was this area of essentially of the Malaysian Peninsula and the island of Sumatra that developed as a maritime empire. And also as well, we'll say it later with the Majapahit in the Malaysian archipelagos. But we will see that more afterwards, more in detail. And the so also in here you have to understand from an ethnical point of view that these populations were relatively mixed, just like other areas were I don't know, the Japanese, for instance, you take they're essentially a fusion between the Koreans and the these Oceanian populations. So, however, the not really Oceanian, however, still in the southeast of Asia. Sorry, now I'm saying a lot of stupid things, but what else can we say? Was definitely conflict, as we've said, in the 10th century with the Khmer, and and it kind of went bad for them, as we've noticed, and there was also a shift in the capital, and there were other conflicts with the north of Vietnam, and the conflicts with the Khmer Empire were revived also later throughout all the 11th and 13th centuries, and there are also, by the way, many beautiful military historical evidence. For instance, there is a relief from late 12th century in the Temple of Bayonne of Angkor. So from the other side, it showed this the Champa. It was actually a naval battle. There was also a lot of maritime warfare involved, fighting against the Khmer. So this empire actually, the Champa declined in towards the 13th and 14th century, in the 15th century. Definitely the Mongol invasions. They definitely invaded Champa, although they had been previously repelled. They eventually occupied the major, the Viaya, if it was the major center, and the Champa at this point, the Cham, because the population would be the Cham, that inhabited the kingdom, retired into the mountains. It was kind of, and began to carry out guerrilla warfare, and 2 years afterwards, in fact, indeed, the Mongols kind of retreated, and there was also other setbacks, so Mongol generals being killed also in another attempt of invasion, and at this point, however, during the 14th century, there was other warfare going on, especially with the Vietnamese of the north, if I'm not wrong, and although this soon came also to a to decline of certain populations around, but the unity of the Champa kingdom basically was last existing at the end of the 14th century. In the Vietnamese eventually in the mid of the 15th century managed instead to invade Champa for this reason, to conquer Ayutthaya, and although they were expelled 1 year after the invasion occurred, other like 1 generation later in the 70s of the 15th century. And at this point, Ayutthaya was taken once again by this very strong Vietnamese army led by the Emperor Le Tan Tong, was actually a great ruler. And after some clashes in 1471, Ayutthaya fell, in fact. And seemingly this was the major blow to the Champa kingdom, as allegedly a very large number of, we're talking about tens of thousands of Cham, were either killed or enslaved, and the North Vietnamese kind of annexed this area. Although, now I was checking one thing. Yeah, sure. So there was a conflict essentially between the north and the south of Vietnam. So this was eventually definitely annexed in the end by the first. And actually there were certain areas in the far south, if I understand correctly, that basically were a bit out of reach, so they kind of remained sort of more client states than actual subjects of the north. But now we venture into the modern age, and we stopped that. And relatively to the Khmer that we were just trying to finish, the as we've seen, there was the Khmer kind of defeated the Champa, but never managed actually to crumble, to make them crumble by themselves. And on the contrary, the Khmer pass after this phase of aggressivism to defend from the west of Siam themselves, and that up to that point had been a client state of the Khmer, and that at this time, however, had begun to rebel, and this kind of saved the Champa initially. And so there is this switch of the Khmer Empire from the offensive to the defensive, and they and certain Thai subjects actually managed to invade the Siam in the 14th century, and excuse me, the same Khmer Empire from Siam itself, and they managed even to sack the same Angkor capital. And in fact, at this point, the capital was also shifted, and the Khmer declined. Indeed, by the 15th century, Angkor is abandoned. And by the end of 16th century, Lovak had become the capital. The kind of is well, it had just become the capital, and I can understand here what it's was, however, at this point was an utter contention between Siam and Annam as well. So basically, the Khmer declined so steadily towards the end of the Middle Ages, and this is, by the way, when the first European influence began to occur with the Portuguese and the Dutch, and eventually with the French but we're pretty late naturally in time, so nothing to do with medieval history anymore. But it's interesting to see how these formations kind of fluctuate a little bit. I mean, there was no major stable power, or at least there was not this I mean, while you see that in other areas like China or India, more or less the places where let's say strong empires formed were always kind of the same. I mean, it was a sort of structural base on which to build. These areas were kind of more fluctuating, and this tells you that there were naturally certain dynamics that are also very difficult to retrace, that however tell us the local powers were kind of less rooted structurally, and this is typical of less developed civilizations. That, I mean, there's nothing like, it's not that they were inferior, they were simply less structured, and they relied on because it's all a matter of surplus. So if you have a long and if you have a steady source of surplus from certain structures, like I don't know, a certain environment, can be rivers, etc. Chiefly rivers were the object of content, etc. But if this wealth is not really enormous and doesn't give you the chance to build upon it, you're still kind of fragile compared to someone else that instead can have definitely a stronger empire, but also other populations that maybe are less civilized than you, but nevertheless for some environmental reason as well are in that moment kind of spreading more for some reason. So you're kind of exposed to such changes, and really the situation in Southeast Asia was extremely complicated. So this added up to the unpredictability, if you want, of the expansion of these populations. And this is how it happened for the Khmer. In 1431 there was this populations of Thai ethnicity that came from the Siam, and this formation was actually better known as the Kingdom of Ayutthaya, I believe it's the name. And as we've seen, they managed to take Angkor as the Khmer capital, and the Khmer, what did the Khmer really ended like? Well, this the Khmer dynasty actually fled also in here to the mountains, and these are these regions that where today there is the city of Phnom Penh, I believe it's pronounced. So I find also this very interesting, this ability of kind of switching, also being able to to remove the center of power from somewhere else and relocating it somewhere else. Naturally, the mountains are less, there's kind of worse environments for developing a certain civilization, but still, this gives you the dimension also of the local potential, in the sense that even if the Khmer had been obliged to go away, even from the lands that were newly conquered by the Ayutthaya kingdom, the Ayutthaya couldn't really wipe out the Khmer dynasty completely from the mountains. And this is important because it's always a matter of resources. I mean, sometimes it's not that you have really to annihilate each other. The most important thing is to control. And you can imagine that there's a lot of syncresis as well between these populations. We're actually also pretty ethnically similar, so they we don't. One trick is we don't have to think it as extremely structured kingdoms or empires. So we're something very fluid. Even there would be a lot to say. Even what is that we mean by empire or by kingdom? Yeah, we can approximate, but every reality is kind of different, and it's based on different balance. So these populations kind of also coexisted by a certain extent, not necessarily being these hard rock systems that kind of necessarily had to clash one against the other. They could really also just switch the balance and determining who was more or less influential to an area and building it the power in that way. The Ayutthaya kingdom. Ayutthaya is a city of Thailand today, and it's in the north of Bangkok, and Ayutthaya actually means invincible. By the way, look at the culture of these peoples. They were extremely warlike, as still partly tribal in origin. So there was a pretty strong warlike ethos. So also in here, Ayutthaya developed because it was located in an extremely fertile region. That's the point. You can't build a city if you don't have the resources. You don't have the base for doing it. Traditionally, it's as kind of it's not really stereotypical, but it's kind of obvious that these areas are extremely fertile for the rice plantations. So this the surplus mostly came from this activity. And according to tradition, and this was a kind of a new power at the time, where as we've seen, the emergence of the Ayutthaya is to be located into the essentially into the 14th century. According to tradition, the Ayutthaya kingdom was founded in 1351 by a sovereign of Lopburi or Suphanburi, that were actually the most important Thai city-states at the time. So also this relation of derivation is kind of interesting. And actually, the Ayutthaya kingdom lived on up to the second half of the 18th century. Then eventually was destroyed by the Burmanian Burman, how you call it, the Burman army, and eventually was rebuilt. But you can see the ruins of the ancient city that were actually pretty large for the area. They were like 14 square kilometers. And there is an historical park today in the area along the shores of the Menam River, and there's also an island in there where this is located. So I'm sorry I can't be more specific. So yeah, I know if it sucks, just don't watch the video. But I'm just going like this. I don't really know excessively more. Maybe one day I'll try to get a bit more in detail. This is a broader overlook at the whole Southeast Asia during the Middle Ages, so it's extremely complicated. So instead, in the fertile plain of at the mouth of the Red River, so what would make up the nucleus of today's Vietnam, there was another kind of Indo-Chinese population, was akin to the Thai, that in the during the oh wait, maybe we could say something else about the Ayutthaya. Well, there would be to say something we didn't actually was important, is that the Ayutthaya had also a great expansion to the north of Malaysia, but this happened later, like in the 15th and 16th century, and actually the Burmans managed to conquer this area already in the 16th century, however. So also in here, kind of political formations that didn't really, that had this kind of exploit, but were excessively rooted. In this sense, the Burmans were more structured by. However, so this is just what the but I don't want to venture in the modern age, as I was saying, because there are actually, obviously, that's better documented, and the modern times are better documented, especially also thanks to the interaction with the Europeans. For instance, the Ayutthaya were the kind of friendly relations with the French at the time in the 16th century as well. However, so there is all extremely, these are all things we theoretically have still to all be studied and researched, and I think in the future there will be this huge field of history dedicated especially to the relations of the Europeans with the, and really to understand, and these local populations to really understand how the latter were really before, because it's not just a matter of saying who ruled there when, and it's also a matter of saying, okay, but what was this civilization really about? What were their what was their mindset, what was their culture, etc. So it's something that goes beyond, can tell us really a lot. And during the modern age, definitely Europeans wrote enough for us to understand a lot of interesting things. So, well, however, I don't know now what can we talk about. We were talking about the Red River, Vietnam, and this what can we say about this now? About Dynastic Vietnam, perhaps. Yeah, the situation here is that this area of the Red River had been essentially dominated by the Chinese. And however, this had started since the beginning of the first millennium, and the Chinese pressures had always been constant. It was at the outskirts of the Chinese Empire. So when you see here, it's like with any other empire at the time, was a lot of decentralized control of these areas. They naturally wanted to remain alone, and but it's it's only in the 10th century that the Vietnamese lords managed to defeat the forces of the Southern Han state, and achieved basically an independence after 1 millennium of Chinese domination, because the Chinese domination actually had started even earlier. The first Vietnamese states that are considered are this something that, I mean, in partly it's legendary. It would have started somehow from the 3rd century BC. So these were kind of all tribes sticking together. Eventually they elected one dynasty, and that's considered traditionally the first state. And these were also pretty warlike, and the Chinese actually invaded these areas around the 2nd century BC, and they were incorporated in the Han Empire by this time. After this conflict, and that's so, especially the Han Empire attacking naturally this area of the Guangdong, Guangxi, and northern Vietnam. So it would be interesting to look at all this in detail, but we don't really have time. What can we say? It's substantially. You can't say, yeah, they were mostly under Chinese. These regions were mostly under Chinese rule for all of the time, but there was some form naturally of autonomy, and a pretty large one, telling the truth. Actually, by the 10th century, when the Vietnamese managed eventually to defeat the Chinese, these areas had already been granted by the Chinese a big deal of autonomy. Excuse me, I drink once again. So this victory over the Chinese brought to the region to be renamed as Great Viet, and this is the moment when Vietnam enjoys the greatest development as autonomous political entity at the time. The Buddhism of the Mahayana tradition was at this time was flourishing and even became the state religion. There were other wars with China, however. There was the Ming whole war that so the Ming Empire invading the North Vietnam, and this campaign basically overthrew the local Ho dynasty, and therefore at this point the Ming managed to briefly retake Vietnam under their empire, but control was lost again. So it was just all like that. And however, you can imagine how much influence there was from China at this point. So once again, the local dynasties reached their a moment of zenith around the 15th century. Very important is the King Le Tan Tong. Was the actually fifth emperor of the Dai Viet under the later Lei dynasty that was ruled up to the end of the 18th century. This is great figure. You can argue that Vietnam at this point was a sort of feudal state in many ways, and you see, however, how important were the Chinese influences also in art, also in the models of power. Naturally, there would be a lot to say about this. By the way, the emperor was very strongly influenced by Confucianism at this time. There was this which brought together introduced this idea that the state had to be ruled by people who were innerly noble and not just from aristocratic families. So this kind of enlightened and philosopher sovereign in great part. And by the way, Vietnam at this point was also kind of aggressive with other powers, including China and Malacca, and this actually brought to a sort of an isolation policy, because that necessarily meant to close trade at a certain point. So I don't know now how to put this. However, they, as was said before, the North Vietnamese managed to conquer the kingdom of Champa, and even part of what had been the Khmer Empire. And so, however, now we enter into the modern age, but that's not the point. However, what is important, the key here, is that there was a strengthening of the Vietnamese identity compared also to the surrounding areas. For instance, the introduction of Confucianism by the Lei dynasty instead of Buddhism is regarded essentially as the main character of the at least at that time, was seen as this putting greater emphasis on the local national traditions. And relatively to this, it's very important the emanation of a code of civil right that was promulgated in 483. It's known as the Hong Duk Code. And this is very important because, for many reasons. First of all, it was this attempt to systematize, essentially, civil and actually also criminal laws throughout old Vietnam. And the problem was, in fact, that, as you know, law is an extremely important mean to control the society as well. So there was this attempt by the late dynasty to strengthen her own power over all these series of lords were scattered everywhere and had all their own power. And this is considered a very important law also because first of all, there is an influence of Confucianism and in this code, and as well as strictly Vietnamese characters that stress the local identity. And the meaning of the code in this sense is a sort of wholly Vietnamese work. And it's important. The code was demanding women to possess property rights and also to enjoy inheritance laws with as much as just like men did. And this naturally was kind of interesting because in China, as we've seen, Vietnam was essentially opposed to China at this point. It was trying to struggle for its own independence from the Chinese interventions and influence, etc. And this importance given to women in the Hang Duc code is a way to say, okay, in Vietnam we do it like that because in Vietnam women had more importance. In China, men. In Vietnam, arguably, women were more important than they were in China. This is what I was saying. So it was seen as a Vietnamese kind of national feature to oppose to the Chinese, saying, okay, we're not gonna stick to your models. Naturally, there are probably more implications at this point because, as we can imagine, as we've already said, the Chinese influence was pretty strong also as a model of so in my opinion this was a move, not much because I don't know, traditionally also in Vietnam women were so considered, but it was rather a way to strengthen the, let's say, the importance of the single subject, because if only males inherit, obviously this brings to a concentration of power into the hands of men. And if you are talking especially into a feudal context into which the problem of the state was to counter especially the feudal aristocracy, this attention towards women was a way to say, okay, but let's give more importance to women so that men, incidentally our rivals as aristocrats and leaders of armies and private retinues, will somehow be stamped. I don't know, in some way. This is just my speculation, I think. However, it could be true also because the Chinese model in this sense was naturally playing also on the local aristocrats of Vietnam in an anti-unitary function for the Vietnamese, because if you are hostile against China, if there is a local Vietnam dynasty that wants to rule over the aristocracy, the local aristocracy is going to say nuts, essentially, and saying things. Okay, I prefer to side with the Chinese. That are at least detached. I mean, they're relatively far than having a dynasty here at home. So sticking to the Chinese model, also in terms of social models, social influences, was definitely a matter of political orientation within Vietnam in itself, and the code was trying to essentially strengthen the centralization. So that's why it's so important. Then we have seen these, and let's talk about at this point about Indonesia. So these lands, these islands that separate the Indian Ocean from the Chinese Sea, and so these areas, as we said before, were very important for the international trade, and especially the western ports were naturally the most developed because they were the closest both to China and to India, and these were the areas that were more influenced by Arab trade that had managed to built a circuit all around, from in the Indian Ocean, so connecting even Madagascar with Sumatra. So the Indian Ocean at this point, it's kind of overlooked how developed it really was. When we were talking about India, I mentioned the Chola Empire that also in here had a great influence and was progressively was competing with the Arab trade. So the also in here, from a strictly historical point of view, the first and the earliest accounts that we have on Indonesia is this very wide archipelagus, date from the time of the Abbasid Caliphate, and the evidently because there were Muslim sailors that were going in there and reporting, especially naturally the resources that were there were important. We mentioned spice trade, and that excuse me, was pretty remunerative, and other commodities such as the of soil and other riches of some the idea here is also the spread of Islam had been naturally important in the process, but it wasn't so intense at all. Actually, the first kind of officially recognized Islamic conversions are pretty late, around the 13th century. And although the islands of Java and the ports of Java and the Borneo were already pretty intensely dominated, economically speaking, by the Arab merchants. So it was unavoidable that Islam would spread in those areas as long as this presence remained. And how do we say, when did Islam began? Because the idea is we know a very few about what was happening at kind of a middle class level, but and it's also difficult to talk about middle class as such. But it's by the 13th century that we have these first conversions of that brought to the creation of first Islamic states in the area. The thing began actually in northern Sumatra. So this began to spread from the west. Naturally, as we said, it was the most developed area, and then eventually expanded into the rest. But also in here, it was not just, I don't know, this an automatical spread. Like in the West, someone began to convert to Islam, and then all the others followed. The conversion to Islam was something very political, because naturally Islam was bringing together with it certain new political models that were evidently coming from much more structured empires and powers, and as always, the local aristocracies were, as everywhere, were extremely interested in strengthening their own power, also through religion and through the models that this religion entailed. And not necessarily just the religion, but also in here the opportunities that could arise from not just from the political dominance, but also from the naturally with privileged relations with the Islamic powers, especially for trade, as we've seen how that was so important. So actually we have to think that the conversion to Islam at this point was something that pertained eminently to the elites. You have to think that religion is not something that spreads so automatically like that. I bring you the word and that it goes. It requires also a certain mindset. The monotheisms are something that do not work into, for instance, tribal societies, because tribal societies reason in a completely different way, and they don't even understand monotheism as such. They can progressively introduce a certain deity, and they can even stick formally to that religion. But monotheism is something that pertains actually to very advanced societies, the ones that have already basically they're sedentary, they have a lot of surplus, and have people who are not just differentiating their own activities to say, okay, I have a god for each own activity. That is what conventionally we call polytheism, as this kind of stage that also is practically impossible to define as a real stage. But the idea is that when you go beyond this, when you have a class of literate of an elite that studies, etc., you start having monotheism, and you start having something that transcends even the same polytheistic view of the world. So you can imagine what Indonesia in high medieval times could really be. So this conversion to Islam was, as a matter of fact, something much more shaded, and it also took a very long time. So the Vulgata is that it began from the northwest in the 13th century, and then all the others followed. Really not. It definitely was a sort of domino effect, because all the various aristocracies began to say, oh, look at those guys, they created an Islamic state, and as such it is stronger, more centralized, and naturally were preconditions for that to happen. But others were looking at that and working actively, pushing towards that direction, for saying, okay, so that as local aristocrats we can build something like that too. And it's obvious that together with this there were local traditions that were still pretty strong. So that syncretism was unavoidable. So Islam, yeah, okay, but it was still one thing with polytheism, or even with animism in a certain measure. So even if during the 13th century you see that Islam spread throughout all the greatest part of Indonesia, and even of the Malaysian peninsula, the local populations were, however, still essentially following their own beliefs. In this process, so the spread of Islam is very interesting to look at from a strictly also geographical point of view, because these were all coastal areas. But if you look at the mountainous areas of this whole region, you see that that's where Hinduism, Taoism, Buddhism, actually remained. So there was a sort of progressive marginalization of such religions into the areas of the interland areas that were less open to trade fluxes. And this naturally went along with a different political idea, so that religion became a distinguishing factor, and this naturally meant that the coastal communities were making a living with these Islamic powers that by this time had, by the way, entered also into India. Let's remember, so also in there wasn't just the Abbasid Caliphate, by the way, at this time, kind of, especially after Mongol invasions, it died out even as after a long decline, but also India now was exporting Islam. So these were all areas that said, okay, we like trade. These guys are Islamic. They also bring with them certain political models. Let's stick to those. The populations of the hinterland that didn't live out of trade with these guys, they said, okay, well, what do we care about converting to Islam? Let's stick with our own local, relatively local religions, because we have seen it was Hinduism, Taoism, Buddhism, so all things that had come from somewhere else. But at least they were kind of more traditional in many ways, at least at that point. And obviously it was a huge deal of paganism all over, and everything was extremely syncretic. So by the 15th century, Islam even reached the Philippines and expanded in there. By the end of 16th century, however, you realize that Islam had not been the first thing. I mean, in areas like Java and Sumatra, you realize that it's only by the end of the 16th century that that Islam becomes dominant, as a matter of fact. An exception in this was Bali, for instance, that remained Hindu majority also through the modern age. And by the way, throughout the colonial period, there is also the arrival of Christianity together with Islam. So also in there were different groups that lived also, and they were pretty large and lived also relatively close to one another, that could be really of different religions. But now also Christianity arrived, and the Europeans were expanding there, so everything was much more complicated. Today we stick to the Middle Ages. So in this there were certain important formations. So Indonesia, as you understood, never had a kind of a unique political domination. Everything was rather fragmented. And so when the Portuguese arrived, especially the Malacca Peninsula came easily under the European say influence, however, and some important dominations were, however, definitely the one of Brunei in the Borneo, that had all these minor, smaller states all around. So really, really fragmented. But also about here, we don't really know much, because before the Europeans arrived, we have a very scarce evidence, and everything we know is kind of legendary, and there are lots of assumptions to that. It's Pigafetta that arrived and began to write extensively, and essentially there is evidence of definitely also Indonesia having been in the orbit of the of Ming China at some point, and there will be further evidence of this in the period. The Chinese were expanding at that time their influence into the northern Borneo. So there was some kind of even mutual interest, always for essentially trade reasons. The thing was a bit more complicated, also politically speaking, but kind of the reasons are almost the same. There was some interaction where also ambassadors, functionaries that arrived from China in the area. I don't know what I can say about this. Also here, it's very difficult to say something that has a true historical value, of which we have enough certainty. However, the conversion to Islam began in 15th century, and also in here, and there are epic poems that basically saying how the Sultanate was created, various stories, and also in here we see that the influence of Arab traders was pretty intense. Also, at this point, at the beginning of the 16th century, the Portuguese arrived into Malacca and the thing. However, this was kind of one of the most, one of the strongest formations in there. Although, as you understand, it wasn't nothing extremely solid as such. The nature of this power basically was there's a lot of emanatism if you want to apply this philosophical concept to political practice. I mean, there is this major center, especially that is such in virtue of its trade, and all these smaller political entities all around, and this was an influence that in fact went fared especially along the coasts and on the seas, while the same the interland of the same island was inhabited by tribal populations that substantially didn't answer to the power of this. And towards the half of the 15th century, the Malacca lordship began to also in here to become a sort of an independent kingdom, always also Muslim in this sense, and they basically stopped to pay the traditional tributes owed to the Thai, to the close Thai kingdom, and this eventually brought to the expansion into the to especially in the coastal areas of Sumatra of the kingdom. And what can we say? Well, there would be a lot to say, but yeah, maybe this sucked by a certain extent. I'm sorry I can't provide more interesting information. However, we managed to kind of cover the whole area, more or less, and I also don't feel great now. I don't know what I have. Hopefully nothing serious. However, what I would like to underline is the kind of the dynamism of these areas. You know, the idea that these are regions where civilization developed in slower, They had lesser powers. There were actually also in Indonesia, and here it is, coastal kind of maritime empire, you can argue. It would be very interesting to study even from a strictly military point of view. And maybe what we'll do, I'm sure that I'm going to expand into Asian military history of the Middle Ages especially, and there are very kind of interesting things to tell. But here it's important, it's the dynamism. It's seeing how in all civilization there is a center that develops because it's favored by the geographical location, because maybe there are trade routes that pass there, or both reasons at once actually, and this center begins to accumulate surplus, and the local aristocracies, there is always someone who is kind of more wealthier than another, begins to build up an aristocracy. This aristocracy begins to control the society through a clientelarly way, so it's able to launch, to strengthen, to consolidate this position, to start investing the resources for expanding into other communities, as long as this is not too expensive, and in order to control and take part of the local revenues, part of the local, to make those people's paying tributes to them, and this is how empires are built ultimately. So it's nothing strange, it's nothing really bizarre, and they all originated from this. The interesting part of this all is how when say civilizations of different stages of development enter into action, the one with the other. I mean, the idea is you have this sharp contrast between, we have seen it especially with the spread of Islam. I've tried to explain it as a mostly political thing, and that's how you should really see not really history of religion as such, because it's obvious that that goes far beyond, but when you start seeing societies growing complex and making certain choices that are immediately political, I mean, as an organized body, so you realize it's not a matter of the local belief that in fact remains even for a long time after the formal conversion of the elites, and therefore you have to interpret it on the basis of the local interests. And it's fascinating how such populations so profitable to strengthen their bonds with these Islamic powers by converting to their own religion, because it tells you how actually about the volumes of the trades that were of the involved trade. This was also a matter of protection, you can imagine, as you can, it's not that the local powers from India, for instance, could have a huge. We've seen the Chola Empire was essentially a maritime empire. Yeah, it could extend as far as Indonesia and controlling certain outposts there. But it's more than that, I mean, you can favor someone even on the distance by privileging certain trade routes going there. Also think that their trade is something automatic really, but at the same time it's something you can have an influence on, you can control also with military expeditions. So the whole thing was much more complex, and I wish I knew more about these topics to really go more in detail. And who knows, I will do that. If you give me time, I surely can grow to read a bunch of things and to kind of get a better picture of the single realities. I wish I had said also more about Vietnam. I found quite interesting because especially with its relation with China, and also for the geography of Vietnam, that you understand is this extremely long stripe of land on the on the eastern coast of the peninsula, and that definitely has a huge that saw the development of considerable powers that were able even to fence off the attacks of the Chinese, of the Mongols. This is something I didn't stress much. It's just that basically the Vietnamese, managed to hold the Mongol advances. Sorry, the advances are something else. That is a kind of a military. Also, this speaks up to local military tradition by several points of view. The Mongol invasion of Southeast Asia was relatively a failure. Also in here, it's not often how much you can do. I mean, it's like a bit with the Romans and the Germans. People say, "Oh, why didn't the Romans eventually kept on conquering Germany or Scotland or other areas where they kind of attempted to invade and eventually they were repelled?" Well, it's not really that. You have to imagine these big empires not being able to conquer those lands, because they actually did that, but it's a matter of how, costs to benefit ratio, and how that's gonna be profitable for you to invest resources to, for instance, to maintain those territories. And the Southeast of Asia, in this sense, is a bit more of a halfway between the civilized world and the tribal world, because we have seen with India that also the Indians managed to fence off the Islamic invasions for some time. However, at a certain point they collapse, and there is the Sultanate of Delhi that gets formed, and there it remains. These populations in Southeast Asia instead were a bit more warlike in origin, because we were more tribal in nature, and they we talked about feudalism for Vietnam, and that is kind of fitting. I'm not aware, if I had to think of other regions that had feudalism in this context, I would have better thought of places like Japan, like Tibet, but evidently, feudalism is arguably something you can, it really depends by which degree you want to consider it. If you have a clientelist society by certain standards, you can talk about feudalism. As long as there is this relation between lords, etc., it's probably misused, because the narrow exception of feudalism is the one we have in the West, that stresses especially this idea of that the king entrusted a royal domain towards to a vassal, and that land was formerly previously owned by the king. So in these regions there had never been a real overlord like that, so you can't talk specifically about feudalism, because it was more of sort of recognition of dominance over certain local lords that, however, had been kind of always in the same in charge of the local area. So it's very difficult to use feudalism in this context, but it's still, in practice, you can argue, I mean, from a strictly political and juridical point of view, but in practice, yeah, you can still talk about a quasi-feudal system, as these were independent lords that were more or less framed into a broader domination. And the Chinese models of sovereignty are also very important, because you can argue that Vietnam and also its clashes against Chinese brought eventually to structure a dominion like the one of the Lei dynasty through the same, not just through the military needs of of compactation, I don't know how to say that, of centralization that are unavoidably required during a war if you want to win it in organizational terms, but how at the same time those who came to power kind of tried to halt the same system, the same Chinese models, because those were they were reinforcing, in fact, the power of the local lords. So it was better to stress a more identitary nature, Vietnam, by looking at the also other elements of society aside from the nobility. We've seen the women as also had to be privileged into inheritance as much as men. So these were naturally attempts. I don't think that the whole thing ever succeeded, but it was a way to stress essentially the also sort of an emancipation from the Chinese power. And as for the Khmer Empire, that is quite interesting. I mean, this dimension of that is more interland, like it's less exposed to external influences, if not from a sheer cultural point of view, and more from India objectively than from China. And in there we see the rise of this Khmer Empire that eventually, however, is probably the most solid dominion in the area. So it's probably occurred because of a compromise between, you know, it was the region was relatively isolated, but this also brought to probably also greater weakness on the long run, because it wasn't something that was being structured on external models. And we've seen with the Ayutthaya kingdom that kind of emerges out of not out of the blue, but however becomes a kingdom on its own in a very short time, that is able to even seize the Khmer capital Angkor and to confine the Khmer into this this area of the Phnom Penh and so easily. So I mean, relatively easily. I mean, I'm sure it was a pretty hard struggle, but nevertheless, it succeeded. So these are kind of the comments I feel to make for now, and I just hope that you enjoyed the video in spite of my ignorance on the topic. And for now, and well, as always, I would say I hope that you enjoyed it, never in spite of all. And if you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.